Okay, sorry about that. I was briefly called away to solve the world's problems, and I did, and now I'm back. But I kind of cut us off unceremoniously. I apologize for that. So we were in the middle of talking about Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, one of the most famous books to try to tackle this gigantic question we're talking about. One of his other explanations for why Europe, which is just, again, luck of the draw for Europeans, was what he talks about as continents that have east-west axes opposed to those that have a north-south axis. And what this means is sort of the shape of the continent. What's the shape of your continent? And that makes a big difference in terms of advantages that once again lead to urbanization, or at least urban-centered societies that take off technologically, etc. So an east-west layout is the way Eurasia, sometimes scholars kind of combine Europe and Asia since they are one landmass. Right, that's laid out on an east-west axis, meaning there's further distances to go east-west than there is north and south. But the opposite is true. North-south axes prevail in South America, in Africa, and what difference could this possibly make? Well, the truth is that geographically speaking, that things tend to be more similar in terms of the environment, ecosystem, weather, type of soil, amount of rainfall. Not totally the same by any means, but they tend to be more similar going across lines east to west. So that ideas about how to farm or about certain types of technology that are developed in, say, China, if and when they spread all the way across to the west side of Eurasia to Europe, that farming technique is applicable there because the soil is more likely to be the same or similar than in a north-south laid out continent. So lines of latitude tend to be able to spread ideas that are more useful, and of course west to east and east to west, so it goes both ways. So say Africa, for instance, what's useful knowledge in North Africa isn't necessarily useful knowledge in sub-Saharan Africa, where there are, among other types of environments, jungle terrain. And also in Africa's case, there are all kinds of obstacles to even travel and communication of ideas, mountains, deserts, jungles, a lot of forbidding geographical barriers. But just the luck, or not such good luck, to be living on a continent that sort of goes in one direction more than the other, according to Diamond, makes a big difference. It could be because of other factors, but it is true that both Europe in the West and China and Japan in East Asia along that east-west axis did move much farther along the lines of urban, eventually industrial, wealthy societies than the continents that moved, or that naturally were laid out geographically the other way. He also talks about, as we'll see other scholars do, that in China, partly because of the terrain, again the geography, large, sort of in some places wide open spaces, huge population density, that it was in some ways natural for China to be centralized sort of in one big unit, one big empire, which it did. There were times where power at the center collapsed and was decentralized for a time, but over the long haul, over the course of millennia and centuries, China really, more often than not, was one big empire controlled from the center, emperor, and his coterie of advisors. In Europe, what developed, partly because of the geography as well, and certainly the political geography turned out this way, they get sort of a number of small fragmented states, at least after the fall of the Roman Empire, which in some ways is more like the model that we see and just mentioned in China. There's a very recent book out called Escape from Rome by a noted historian, a gigantic book, but a good one. And his very point is that Europe was lucky that the Roman Empire fell. And in its wake got, instead of one unified kind of Europe, the Roman Empire never unified all of Europe, but did a lot of it. But Europeans were lucky, again, that if this interpretation holds, and I believe it does, that they got a number of small, medium-sized countries, states, kingdoms, England, France, Spain, etc., as opposed to one big empire. Why? Because the fragmented states, all close together, all independent of each other, at most times, forced a lot of competition. You're always afraid of what your neighbor is going to be able to acquire in terms of military technology, economic growth, trade, and you're always looking over your shoulder, and so it motivates you, forces you, right? Gives you incentive to have to innovate, upgrade, improve, make your economy, political system, legal system, army, navy, better and better and better, bigger and bigger and bigger to compete, because there's lots of potential competitors around you, with lots of states, lots of separate governments. In China, there was not that kind of pressure, according to this interpretation and theory. Again, it could be wrong. All of these could be wrong, but I think this does have some explanatory power, so that the Chinese Empire not only was big of it in itself, because it was so big, it dominated East Asia and even beyond into South Asia, and so there wasn't as much incentive for them to have to worry about building up their military technology, etc., because who was going to challenge them in their area? And there's a famous example of this that Diamond and other thinkers, some of whom are also on our PowerPoint presentation here, deal with in their books. The Chinese developed the most outstanding high-tech naval fleet, a navy that was second to none in the early 15th century. And it made, I think, six or seven voyages to the Indian Ocean and back to China through kind of the Indian Ocean trade areas. Never engaged in combat. Did these kind of goodwill tours, which of course happen in history. They're not really goodwill tours, that's what they say, but their ships are kind of meant to, they come in a friendly way, but it's meant to send the message, look what we have here, don't mess with us, because we could come back and start shooting at you with these things. But there was the biggest fleet in the world at the time, the most technologically sophisticated, etc., way more than anything the Europeans had. But the Chinese emperor at the time decided eventually to scuttle the whole fleet, because he was persuaded by some of his advisors, mandarins as they were known, that the government couldn't afford to pay both for military operations, defensive on land against the Mongols and other nomadic peoples to the north, who were a thorn in China's side for centuries, and pay for a large naval fleet at the same time. So there was a very fateful decision to do that, to scuttle the navy. And so there was, but part of it was, again, there just wasn't as much incentive for China, because it was such a big, powerful empire, and there was nobody near it that could challenge it, that they didn't necessarily need to have a navy that size. That's just not true of a country like Spain or Portugal or France that have a lot of coastline and lots of, again, competitors within Europe nearby. So big empire versus fragmented states, China versus Europe. The fragmented state model, which just sort of lucked into happening, ends up giving unforeseen advantages, unintended consequences in history, which is something I've already kind of explained to you. David Landes's The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, 1999, so right around the same time. And by the way, Diamond's book that we just talked about and Landes's book here are both examples of long-term lock-in theories. So Diamond is saying it was just luck that Europe, got more powerful than the rest of the world first, but nonetheless, it was basically destined to happen because of the geography, including the elements I just mentioned. One review of Landes's book, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations. He's a Harvard professor, Landes. His exploitation of the wealth and poverty of nations is simple. Rich nations are once poor nations that developed market economies. Poor nations are once and still poor nations that did not. Market economies require governments that do not interfere with people's economic affairs except to protect property rights. Landes builds his case by recounting the history of world economic development. In fact, Landes is an economist and sort of an economic historian, so this book does have kind of an economic bent to it, but he connects, I think it's the most interesting part of this book, he connects the economy or economic phenomena and thinking to culture. So the same review goes on to say, Landes maintains that Western European and especially British culture is superior to others at promoting people's well-being. So it's not saying superior in an overall sense or superior genetically or biologically, but it is saying, that as we said at the outset, Ian Morris' phrase, getting things done. In terms of technology, wealth, power. So Landes maintains that European, and more specifically British culture, was better at promoting people's well-being, getting things done. He makes the same case for the virtues of Protestantism, Protestant Christianity, that is. The Roman Church, Roman Catholic Church, found truths about nature in the Scripture, so new ideas were potentially subversive. Protestant culture gave individuals more freedom to think for themselves, to innovate, and to keep the rewards of their successes. The notion that one culture is as good as another is wrong, Landes argues, at least if one judges a culture by its ability to enhance the well-being of its practitioners. Now, Landes has been criticized, and rightfully so, to some degree, for maintaining an arrogant view of sort of European superiority. But I would sort of caution students to be a little bit careful. I mean, you could certainly criticize him for that, and you wouldn't necessarily be wrong. It's open to argument. But he is saying not necessarily superior. He's not saying superior in an overall sense. He's just saying that the European systems that developed and culture that developed ended up being more sophisticated and efficient, workable in terms of advancing wealth and power. What does Protestantism have to do with it? To some degree, Landes openly, explicitly revives Max Weber's thesis. Weber was a sociologist and economist, wide-ranging thinker, German in origin, around the early 20th century, who wrote his most famous book on the connection between Protestantism and capitalism. And he believed that Protestant values of hard work and sobriety and putting off pleasure until later, a lot of sort of work ethic type values that were in their religious values helped lead to capitalism in Europe before in other places, again, but kind of by luck and by chance, but that the luck, nonetheless, is partially, in his view, what led to Europe taking the lead in terms of wealth and power. He also talks about, in Wealth and Poverty of Nations, dense population favoring large-scale, powerful centralized government in China, which reduced incentives to explore, expand, improve technology, etc., etc. So the Chinese didn't get to America by ship, which they surely could have with that incredible fleet that they built. It's true that the Pacific is a much longer crossing than the Atlantic, so the Europeans and Columbus had it easier in getting to the Americas because they were closer already. But China could have done it, but the incentive, I think, wasn't there. They had sort of all the power and wealth, at least in their part of the world, they needed, and it wasn't clear yet that they would need more than that, and would need to sort of innovate too much, and they didn't. Some scholars claim Europe is a latecomer and free rider on the early achievements of others. This is now David Landis himself. That is patently incorrect. As the historical record shows, for the last 1,000 years, Europe, the West, has been the prime mover of development and modernity. So those are the kind of statements that get him into trouble and make him controversial, because it makes him sound like a staunch Eurocentric thinker, and in some ways he is. So he's open to criticism there. So as I've tried to indicate from the outset of this class, and we'll try to stay consistent with, I'm not here to tell you what to think about history. I'm sort of giving you many different sort of vantage points, and some of those come through the works of noted historians and professors, intellectuals like David Landis. Another well-known long-term Lockean book that also is sort of open to the same type of criticism comes from the well-known current history professor at Harvard and partly at Stanford's Hoover Institute as well, Niall Ferguson. He's British or Scottish in origin. David Landis is an American. But one could say of both of them that they're biased in favor of Europe because Europe and the United States are part of Western civilization, and this is partly why Landis and this guy and others like them have similar ideas get criticized today. Fair enough. He says, Niall Ferguson, that is, it was an idea that made the crucial difference between British and Iberian America, an idea about the way people should govern themselves. Some people make the mistake of calling that idea democracy and imagining that any country can adopt it merely by holding elections. In reality, democracy was the capstone, meaning kind of the final product of an edifice that had as its foundation the rule of law. To be precise, the sanctity of individual freedom and the security of private property rights ensured by representative constitutional government. So Ferguson's argument in his book Civilization, The West and the Rest, and yes, even the title is sort of controversial. I think he probably meant it to be. He must have seen that saying the West and the rest would sound dismissive, to put it mildly. But he's of the belief that it's British and European Western civilizations, countries, including the U.S., political systems and their values centering on freedom, rule of law, that really explain everything that sort of came afterwards, including their contributions to the scientific revolution, going through the industrial revolution first, and again getting an advantage in wealth and power over the other parts of the world, other countries. He talks about the importance of the idea and value of competition. Again, Europe's huge inroads in the beginnings and development of modern science, to property rights already mentioned, advances in medicine, consumer sort of market-oriented economy and society, with peasant farmers or just average poor farmers already engaging in sort of market activity long before many other peoples of the world and long before other European countries, so specifically Great Britain, but other European countries kind of just after Great Britain, a strong work ethic. Now, and we'll see some of this in some of the books that follow, saying that the Europeans had a superior work ethic and a commitment to competition, etc., can also be seen as, wait a minute, you're saying that other peoples don't have a work ethic, or at least not as good a work ethic as Europeans, and that is sort of what's being said here. But again, you can call Ferguson a racist if you like, but I think he should at least be heard. I'm less interested in labeling people with sort of derogatory terms, at least until and after I give their ideas sort of full voice. It's quite common now for people to denounce writers or intellectuals without having read their work, which I find is lazy and irresponsible. So if you read Niall Ferguson and find his books to be racist, or this book to be racist, or at the very least Eurocentric, biased in favor of Europeans, fair enough. But I'd read it first. And it could also, of course, be true that it is Eurocentric, but also, which is a legitimate criticism if true, but that it might also offer something that contributes to knowledge in a positive way at the same time. Books aren't usually kind of all or nothing, all right or all wrong, all good or all bad. He's a very gifted historian. He's written many, many good books. This is maybe his most controversial. There's some other controversial ones too. Now we get to the rest of these are short-term kind of accident theorists who think that just luck, that the West sort of got the lead and got more power and in a sense conquered the world for quite some time in the exact time period we're studying in this class. And so these people are much more critical of the more traditional viewpoints of the scholars, the three of whom we just talked about, starting with John Hobson's book, The Eastern Origins of Western Civilization, basically claiming that Europe stole ideas and stuff from everyone else. The traditional view, he says, can be called Eurocentric, meaning it centers on Europe and sort of kind of starts from Europe and sort of sees everybody else in relation to Europe, which many believe is a viewpoint that distorts the truth. And there's, I think, some truth in this. He says, for at its heart is the notion that the West properly deserves to occupy center stage of progressive world history, both past and present. But does it? This familiar but deceptively seductive Eurocentric view is false for various reasons, not the least of which is that the West and East have been fundamentally and consistently interlinked through globalization ever since 500 CE or AD, roughly speaking. So he talks about the many inventions and innovations that came from China and other places that the Europeans capitalized on. Many intellectual and cultural developments that came from the Muslim world and Asia, etc. Also talks about how the Europeans used primarily silver that they stole from Native Americans after they started to colonize the Americas from Columbus onward. And it's that they used to acquire imperial and colonial power and sort of, in a sense, conquering much of the world, fully insinuating themselves in the Indian Ocean, Asian trade networks, etc. A criticism there, deserved, that Europeans may not have been able to take power and become the most powerful part of the world if they hadn't gone and stole silver from Native Americans. However, they already had to have a certain amount of power to be able to do that in the first place, because Native Americans did not cede their lands and their resources and their cultures willingly to Europeans. They put up quite a fight, in fact. He also Hobson, that is, in this book, says that European power did not come from democracy, did not come from free trade, not from rule of law, but just from brute force. So highly critical of the long-term lock-in theorists, and certainly including the three authors that we just covered. The Eastern Origins of Western Civilization says much of it in the title itself. Another book written around the same time as the ones we've been examining is Andre Gunder Frank's Re-Orient, Global Economy in the Asian Age. And this has a lot to do with what he considers to be Columbus's lucky mistake that changed the world. Keep in mind, Columbus, who famously sailed west to get to Asia, knowing that the earth was round, as all educated people did in his day, said, well, the Portuguese are going around the tip of Africa and sailing east to get to the Indian Ocean trade in Asia, which was the heart and center of the world economy. Europeans knew it. That's what they're trying to get there. Columbus then said, well, if that's true, if it's true as we know it is, that the earth is round, you should be able to sail east or west to get to Asia and the Indian Ocean trade. And so he proposed to do it that way, and eventually got a taker on his idea. He went around Europe selling it, trying to sell it, kind of door to door. Got turned down in Portugal, England, France, and eventually the Spanish monarchy famously signed on, and financed his voyage and found others to help finance the voyage. The first one and those that followed. Columbus made 4 voyages to the New World. But again, he was trying to find Asia. He was trying to find a western route to China, Japan, India, and the Indian Ocean trade. So the lucky mistake was that he didn't know that North and South America were there. No Europeans did. And in fact, nobody outside of North and South America did at the time. Native Americans were the only ones that were in on a little secret that there were 2 continents that nobody else knew about. So the lucky mistake is, hitting the Americas when he was trying to get to Asia. Why was it a lucky mistake? Because America ended up being incredibly fruitful for Europe and European kingdoms and countries. It changed the world. And of course, this meant, as I'm sure you know, the Europeans brutalizing and running roughshod over Native American societies. Yes, with lots of resistance, but with millions of Native Americans perishing through diseases brought by Europeans, from warfare, enslavement by Europeans, to dig out the silver and gold in Mexico and Colombia, Bolivia. So it was certainly ugly, and some historians go so far as to say that the Europeans committed genocide toward Native Americans, and that well may be apt. Whatever we call it, it was certainly ruthless, incredibly cruel and barbaric in many ways. Nonetheless, it did have a big hand in sort of placing Europe, raising Europe's status in terms of its wealth and power. So this guy here, Gunder Frank, a European scholar, says, one of my early purposes in the present book is to show first that there was already an ongoing world economy before the Europeans had much to do and say in it. Asia was much more active than Europe was until about 1800. The world economy did not begin in Europe. So he's saying we have to be careful here, because though Europe eventually did sort of take the lead, it didn't do so until 1800, and for a long time it was behind China and India economically, at least, in other ways as well. He turns, as he says, Eurocentric, meaning European-centered, kind of European-biased history, writing, and social theory upside down. And his thesis, his argument, is that we must analyze the whole, which is more than the sum of its parts. So he's saying that the European economy in these centuries. The Europeans' rise to power aren't even explainable unless we sort of look at the whole and see how all the parts of the world kind of interacted. Like some other short-term kind of accident thinkers, he's saying that Europe relied heavily and had no choice on what it learned and took, and how it interacted with other peoples, and how other peoples sort of end up helping them to sort of climb to the top in terms of power. You can sort of read the rest of that on your own. There are some more specifics in there, sort of more twists to his argument.